Good afternoon. It's Tuesday. It's 1 p.m. Eastern. Welcome to Advancement Live. Advancement Live is part of the Higher Ed Live Network, a series of professional development web shows and podcasts which are always free and accessible to you in our archives at higheredlive.com and on iTunes. Be part of our broadcast by tuning in live and sharing your insights and questions using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. You can receive weekly updates with live show dates and times by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. As my screen says, I am your host for today's show, Andrew Gossen, and thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be tackling one of my favorite topics, disintermediation. Disinter what? Disintermediation. It is a graceless word, but it is a useful concept. We're talking about it because it helps us to understand one of the major challenges confronting higher ed advancement in a digitally networked world, as well as think about how we might respond to this challenge in a productive way for both our institutions and our audiences. But before we dive into this topic, I want to give a shout out to our Advancement Live sponsors, iModules and mStoner. iModules software is the leading constituent engagement management provider for educational institutions. iModules delivers an integrated online platform that transforms how institutions strengthen constituent relationships and achieve fundraising success. iModules, thank you for your support. We couldn't do this without you. Higher Ed Live is also produced by mStoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. mStoner, thank you for the support. And now, on with the show. So disintermediation. What the heck is disintermediation, and how does it relate to institutional advancement? Well, there are three pieces of groundwork that I need to lay for this conversation to make sense. First, what does disintermediation mean? Well, in a nutshell, it means reduction in the use of intermediaries. In some cases, reduction in the use of intermediaries actually shades over into complete elimination of intermediaries. This concept actually emerged from the world of banking back in the 1960s, when it first became possible for consumers to invest directly in securities rather than leaving the money in banks for investment on their behalf. This concept has been adapted and used productively in a number of other areas, including supply chain management. And in a supply chain context, reducing the number of intermediaries usually means lower costs, which can then lead to lower prices, higher profit margins, or both. So that's the first point. Second, the concept of disintermediation has been used really effectively to explain the impact of the internet on the world of business. I hope most of us will agree that for many established industries, the impact of the internet has been nothing short of seismic. Think about the disappearance of local travel agencies after the advent of Expedia, for instance, or the impact of Amazon on local bookstores, or of Netflix on Blockbuster Video. What was going on was that local businesses that aggregated information or products were being disintermediated by websites that offered much more selection, and usually both greater convenience and lower prices. It's really important to point out that these established industries didn't suddenly start doing something stupid or irresponsible. They were still offering services that had served customers well and been profitable in the past. They just got wiped out by business models that suddenly were possible because of the digital revolution, and they were no longer competitive. Third, I think you can make a very compelling case that those of us working in institutional advancement are intermediaries. We are the people who connect our institutions to various different types of audiences, and we then mobilize those audiences for a range of ends that advance the work of our teachers, our researchers, and our students. So at a time that 40% of the planet is connected via digital networks in real time, it is really, really dangerous for people whose primary role is that of being an intermediary to be comfortable and complacent, no matter how effective we have been in the past. Just like the travel agencies and bookstores and Blockbuster, we may be trying to offer our employers and audiences publications and engagement opportunities that have been effective in the past. But in a digitally networked world, our audiences now have ways to interact with our institutions and each other in ways that do not require our involvement. What used to work doesn't work as well anymore. And if we can't figure out ways to remain relevant, both we and our institutions may have real problems. This is a real challenge, and it's a challenge that's having an impact on all three areas of advancement. In the past, communications, alumni affairs, and development professionals have done much of their work within silos. Part of what we're hoping to do on today's show is to start to connect the dots between these areas. We're all dealing with disintermediation now, and it may be that moving forward productively will require us to work together in ways that we haven't before. Today's guests are ideally positioned to connect these dots and to help us understand how disintermediation has impacted each of the three advancement areas, thereby setting a stage for a more general conversation about what we can do to adjust and to move forward. So today's first guest is Andy Careaga, who joins us from Missouri University of Science and Technology. Andy is the Director of Communications for Missouri S&T, and his department is responsible for managing Missouri S&T's brand identity and coordinating marketing efforts with other divisions and departments on the campus of 8,100 students. He's a well-known writer about higher ed marketing, branding, and PR on his blog, which you can find at andrewcareaga.wordpress.com. And he presents frequently on branding, public relations, social media marketing, crisis communications, change management, and related subjects. A past contributor to Case Currents, Andy also wrote a case study about social media's role in crisis communication in the book Social Works, which was published in February 2013 by ED Universe Media. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Andy, of all the people I've met in advancement, you are probably the single person who has been thinking and talking about disintermediation for the longest period of time. And I'm actually tweeting out links to an article that you wrote back in 2008 about this. Could we start off by having you tell us a little bit about what triggered your initial awareness that communications professionals needed to be thinking seriously about disintermediation?
Sure, be glad to. So you're referencing a blog post from 2008. Actually, it was about that time or a little bit before then that I started reading some of the more popular items in the press and some of the issues related to supply chain management. I read The World is Flat, Tom Friedman's book. He talked a lot about the flattening of hierarchies, the flattening of organizational structures, and how that was changing business models all over the world. So that got me thinking a little bit about the idea of disintermediation. And of course, I was seeing the same things you were referring to in terms of the travel agencies changing the way that they do business, or actually going by the wayside because of the way the internet was changing the way they were doing business. So the other issue was looking at the dramatic changes in the news industry at the time. There were a lot of layoffs happening. There was a lot going on in terms of the business model of newspapers, other news organizations. And so I started thinking about the diminished role that news media play, or were playing at that time, in terms of being intermediaries between us and the publics that we were trying to reach. So that was kind of where my thinking got started. It was really about my role in public relations and media relations and the diminished role of the news industry.
And as you started talking about this, both with your colleagues at S&T and within the case community, what was their response? Did they see things in a fashion similar to yours, or were they trying to pretend that this wasn't happening?
Well, I think it was kind of a mixed bag. I think a lot of people were also, cued into what was going on in terms of what was happening in the world around us, in terms of what was going on in the news media. We weren't necessarily thinking of ourselves as intermediaries. We were thinking about how our role as trying to communicate for our institutions was being disrupted by disintermediation. There's two big dis words for us today. So, we were thinking about new approaches. How should we tackle this new world? So, some administrators on our campus were hesitant at the beginning when we were talking about these things, but they let us experiment a little bit.
It does feel like it's sort of a conceptual hurdle that you have to clear to actually think of yourself as a disintermediary. If all you normally do is think about what the actual duties of your day job are, and abstracting up to the point that you can see yourself in that intermediary position, I guess it's not natural unless someone points it out to you.
Perhaps. I don't know. It's one of those things that, when we see what's happening, when we see the disruption in other industries, everything from the recording industry to the bookstores to the travel agencies, insurance, banking, as you mentioned, we should be thinking about how that can affect us. in our industry? Could it happen? Could it happen to higher education? And so we were having those conversations. Really, from the communication side of things, we started thinking about how could we reach our audiences more effectively, more directly, without the intermediaries, like the news media, for example.
So what were some concrete examples of things that you tried to deploy in recognition of this?
Well, actually, a couple of years before that blog post, we started our first blog at the university, and it was a blog to write about the research that was going on campus. One of the challenging aspects, and those who are in media relations, I think, can relate to this, are oftentimes you have some stories that you think are fantastic, but they just don't get picked up, they don't have legs, they don't become the stories that our audiences would see. So we tried to think about how can we talk about some of the cool research going on, number one, that wasn't being picked up by the news media, and number two, that may not necessarily be something we would write about in a news release. So we started thinking about how could we share that information in a more effective way and try to get our audience interested. So we created that research blog. That was one of the first steps.
As you were beginning to undertake initial experiments like that, were there any things that you stopped doing to create the bandwidth so that you could do this sort of experimentation?
I wish I could say that we did. We've tried to stop some things, but one thing that I've discovered in terms of communications, that with every new medium that comes along, every new approach that comes along, it never displaces any of the previous types of communications vehicles. We were still going to be communicating with our audiences in the ways that they preferred. So if journalists still wanted news releases, we would still be providing news releases. What it had to do with was more about how do we repurpose content and how can we reuse content in a different way. So we didn't, I can't really think of an example where we just said we're going to stop doing this and just switch gears here, but we did change some of our processes and some of our thought patterns in terms of how we communicate. So if we have a story, is it just a magazine story? Is it just a news release? Is it just a blog post? No, we started thinking about how could we republish and reuse that content in different platforms.
And as you've been going through that process of rethinking your processes, have you shifted your thoughts on how you measure what you're doing and how you define success? We have
quite a bit, in fact. So we're thinking, we're talking more about how do we think like a media organization? How do we approach the work that we do as though we were a media organization? So when we're communicating to different audiences, we're thinking of ourselves as the first publisher of information, the first publisher of stories in different ways. So that's changed the way that we think and the way that we measure our successes. Of course, when we're using online, when we're publishing to the online world, measurement then can become more tangible and easier to report back what works to administrators and others, so that we can see some of the results by measuring online through analytics, etc. So it really has changed that sort of paradigm. At the same time, though, we still know there's an expectation to do media relations the way we have in the past, to communicate with audiences in the ways that they are more comfortable and the way in which they expect to receive information. So while we are doing more online, we are also continuing the Alumni magazine, for example. We're continuing media relations in a more traditional fashion.
And how are you coping with the increasingly obvious organic conversations that are taking place online about your institution? Are you tracking that? Are you trying to identify and share content that lines up with institutional messaging and institutional priorities, or that's just likely to be interesting to your audience?
We do. We try to, I think a lot of us now in higher education are getting better at listening to the conversations that are going on online, on Twitter, Facebook, other forms of social media. And then also, I think monitoring is key. I think taking more of a customer service approach sometimes, responding in a way that you're solving a problem is also important. So it's a little bit different than what we've done in the past, simply because we're looking at taking a different approach to monitoring and listening to the conversations that are happening so that we're aware. And part of that also involves sharing that information, sharing the intel that we get with other folks on campus.
Andy, thank you. That's a great overview of how disintermediation has played out in the communications sphere. Well, the communicators were probably the first of the advancement silos to be hit by disintermediation. They certainly were not the only ones, and I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of this whole phenomenon. Joining us now to talk about how disintermediation has played out in the alumni affairs world is Christine Tempesta, who is the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Alumni Association at MIT. Christine focuses on volunteer leadership identification and development, metrics, and strategic projects that mirror institutional mission and vision. She is also currently serving as Interim Senior Director of Information Systems and Services. Christine arrived at MIT in 1996 after a 13-year career with the American Heart Association, and she demonstrates her entrepreneurial skills in volunteer management, event planning, marketing, communications, fundraising, and social media. A strategist and ardent fan of technology, she works online and off to create community and establish meaningful interactions between alumni, students, and staff, and she also serves as chair of the CASE District 1 Board of Directors. Christine, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andrew. Happy to be here.
So Christine, Andy just walked us through how disintermediation has changed the work of the communications professionals operating in advancement shops. Could you tell us a little bit about how you first started this phenomenon playing out in the world of alumni affairs?
Yeah. You know, surprisingly, I was thinking about it, and I went all the way back to my start in alumni affairs back in 1996. And I thought about how we were being disintermediated out of club and class activities because we weren't providing a way for folks to register online. And even though lots of alumni wanted a way to register online, a lot of alumni also thought that this was something that really was unnecessary. So I was spending time in the late 1990s convincing people that we needed to get online and start taking registrations that way. You know, then after that, probably in the early 2000s, you saw a lot of groups working on affinity, you know, sort of developing lots and lots of affinity groups, mostly based on what alumni did when they were students. And you saw just, you know, huge numbers of affinity groups popping up at various institutions, popping up all over the place. But they were still, institutions at that time were still trying to control the activity centrally, which can be a bit of a losing battle when you're up to hundreds of groups. So for me, the concept is really important, but I will say that I've often seen it used as an excuse why programs don't work as well as they should, or why they don't work as well as they used to. And I don't really buy that mentality.
I really like your example of the online registration, and that the pressure there was coming from alumni themselves. And I think that points to something we'll return to later on in the more general discussion, the whole issue of the importance of value to alumni, and how if services that we're offering to alumni are not as valuable as other options out there, they're pretty happy to leave us in the rearview mirror as they move on to somebody who's willing to interact with them the way they want to be interacted with.
That's right.
Do you think that that can be construed to be a sign of diminishing strength of ties between alumni and the alma mater?
It can be if you allow it to be. The bond is not necessarily between the individual alum and the alma mater, but between the people and the experiences that they had. And you mentioned listening at the outset of the show. It's really important to do that. The thing is, the programs that people think are no longer relevant because of disintermediation may never have been relevant at the institution in the first place, and that is a big challenge. So especially as new programs grow, you see a younger university or maybe an international university trying to start something like a reunions program. There may not be class affinity. They may never have had class affinity. At my own alma mater, I was the class secretary for years, and I never received a single class note That's because there's no class affinity at my alma mater. So why would anyone try to develop a program around that? I think you really have to be listening to what's important and thinking about how you can not only act as an intermediary, but also as a catalyst for activity.
I think those are really important points that you're raising there, and it's I guess what I'm taking away from that comment is that as you're trying to figure out how to be relevant in today's world to your alumni body as it is right now, you need to know where your strengths are, and you also need to know what's simply not likely to work. And one of the questions I was going to ask you is, are classes and clubs still relevant as the core communities around which Alumni Affairs has structured itself for the past 100 years?
Yeah.
And it seems to me like you're suggesting that in some cases perhaps, and there are other cases in which you shouldn't bother.
Right. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, reunions are great activities at many schools, Princeton for one, where you were, you know, the P-Raid. Who wouldn't want that? But it's not going to work everywhere, and you really have to listen to what it is that your alumni want, your constituents want, and by the way, your constituents are broader than just the alumni body. In terms of disintermediation, one of the things that has changed my thinking a little bit is thinking that came from our leadership here, that we're trying to first serve the institution by serving the alumni, and it's a very slight paradigm shift, but it's important. If we're serving the institution by connecting the alumni, we're thinking differently about the kinds of services that we want to provide to them. And it helps us to think about why we want to do the work we're trying to do.
So that's an interesting point, in that many of the core roles of alumni offices, historically anyway, such as producing alumni directories and organizing events, they seem a little bit less essential, at least from the perspective of an alumni or an alumnus or end user, in a world in which they can find each other on Facebook, and they can start up groups around their own priorities, and they can organize their own events through tools like Eventbrite. Do you think that alumni offices should still be investing resources in these areas?
Again, it's going to depend on the individual office. I can't see where a print directory, frankly, is going to be that much of a success anywhere. I wouldn't invest in it. I know a lot of shops do them on a regular basis. But as to online directories and private communities, one size really doesn't fit all. Here at MIT, we still have a large number of alumni who are logging in and using our online alumni directory on a regular basis. That wouldn't happen at my alma mater. It wouldn't happen at a lot of other schools, colleges, and universities. So we think for us, you know, we're looking at the directory, we're trying to work on feature enhancements. At other institutions, the alumni are not going to utilize the online network in the same way. So it's a matter of meeting them where they are, you know, thinking about where is the institution, where are the alumni, and where can we bring them together, and not doing things just because a peer institution is doing them. Our job is to build those relationships between the alumni and the institution, and we should know our alumni's interests as intimately as we possibly can.
And it sounds like in the undergrowth of that comment, there's a need to be measuring things effectively, so that if there are things you're trying to do that clearly are not working, that are not providing value, you at least can recognize that, and you can pivot and try a different course. Right,
and having everybody measuring equally, or at least understanding a broad set of metrics across all the silos, as you like to call them, is really important. So having kind of one engagement goal, we're going to engage people, and then thinking about how they cut across different elements is really important. Making sure everyone understands that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christine. I'm really excited to come back to this whole topic of value from the perspective of the end user and how that relates to institutional priorities. But first, let's tackle the third leg of the advancement tripod and talk to Jen Kwiatkowski from the Cornell Annual Fund. I think the fundraising aspect of disintermediation is particularly interesting in that fundraisers were really insulated from disintermediation for a long time. But the inevitable is finally happening, and our development colleagues are finally working to make sense of how their landscape is changing around them. So Jen Kwiatkowski is Associate Director of Marketing and Participation in the Cornell Annual Fund. Prior to this position, Jen worked with the Reunion Campaign, Senior Class Campaign, and student phoning programs within the Annual Fund. After several record-setting years mobilizing students around senior class giving and student phoning, Jen is now focused on the young alumni population. A firm believer in the importance of alumni participation, she has been eager to explore how to complement Cornell's fundraising efforts in the Annual Fund by using social media, and she holds a bachelor's degree from Colgate University. Jen, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
So let me start you off with a nice softball question. So the Anglo-American model of fundraising for colleges and universities is right now being copied all over the world as state support for higher education is being cut back pretty much everywhere. How is it that disintermediation is having an effect on a model that has worked so well for so long?
I think the first piece is just being aware of our context. You know, typically we've relied on mail and phone to reach people, and we're seeing that those two methods are just not working as well anymore. They're not working at all, so we wouldn't want to get rid of them entirely, but people are not opening their mail, people are not answering the phone, and we've got to think about new creative ways to get a hold of them. Email obviously is becoming more and more useful to us, but still that's a tool that is certainly not the magic bullet that we had hoped. So something that we've seen working well at Cornell is this the idea of crowdfunding and using social networks to raise money for certain projects. I think what's different about crowdfunding as a tool is that we don't often see people go out and fundraise on their own through mail and email. They're not eager to run to the post office and send bulk mail. But through crowdfunding, the tools are available and they're not expensive, and so we see people, you know, as they identify priorities that they care about, they now have tools to go out and fundraise completely separately from what we're trying to do as an organization. So it's been an interesting experiment to try to wrap that into the methods that we're using to get people on board with giving to Cornell.
And it feels like that's a particularly clear and present danger for fundraisers where so much of your metrics and your sense of success are dependent on being able to count every dollar towards the bottom line. I mean, it's one thing if fewer people are logging into your alumni directory, but it's quite another thing if people are raising money and it's not even being counted by the fundraising organization.
Absolutely. I think that's the top level fear for sure, and I think the advantage to the way we count things is that through fundraising it's very easy to look at dollars and donors, except if you can't count them because people are doing their own thing. So it's absolutely a threat to us, just as we think about how we've traditionally been able very easily to count donors to Cornell.
So you work with young alumni, and I think if you look at most of the statistics and the studies of young alumni giving rates across the board at colleges and universities in the US and Canada, we're seeing a slow and steady decline. Do you think that this is a sign of an erosion of the effectiveness of appeals to give back to the alma mater because of a sense of duty or some sort of an obligation to give back? Or is it a missed opportunity because we're simply not where our people are?
I think it's both things. I do think a big piece of it is the cultural shift. I think there's less of a feeling that it's just your duty to give back. Personal speculation, I wonder about the rising costs of education, and because it's becoming so expensive to attend Cornell or other colleges and universities, you kind of feel when you leave potentially like, well, I've paid for it. That, you know, I've already spent a lot on this, and it isn't necessarily my obligation to give back. Whereas older generations may have had a different sense of duty. So I think part of it is a cultural shift. But another big piece I do think is that we are not taking advantage of the tools that we have to reach people where they are and using the technology that's working through other organizations.
It also seems like there is competition for the philanthropic dollars of donors at the bottom of the pyramid. So obviously that's the young alumni audience with which you work primarily, with a few clear exceptions. To what extent do you think part of the problems that higher ed is having coping with disintermediation relates to the fact that there's an emerging breed of new and nimble cause-based nonprofits that are highly active online?
I think that's a big piece of it. I mean, we've always faced competition to a certain degree, but 40 and 50 years ago, there weren't not nearly as many organizations out there fundraising as there are now. And we aren't as new and nimble as many of the organizations that are out there competing for philanthropic dollars. I also think we have a harder time as an industry sharing impact information. And when you can see exactly where your $20, that's all you can afford, is going at another organization, and it's harder for us to tell you exactly where that's going. I think that's an uphill battle for us that we need to find a way to work on.
And it sounds like that relates to the classic appeal for unrestricted funds that's at the core of so many annual giving and annual fund programs. It seems like study after study is showing that millennial donors especially are very much looking for a sense of direct connection to the causes that they're invested in or the people that they're trying to support.
Absolutely. I think there's certainly not a lack of willingness out there. I don't think that this generation is unwilling to give, but I think they're really looking for where they can get the most bang for their buck. And typically unrestricted giving, it's a lot harder to say exactly where your buck is going. Whereas in many other organizations, like I said, they can tell you exactly that your $20 tomorrow will go here, and boy, do we need it badly. And we do still need it at Cornell and in other colleges and universities for sure, but it is harder to say exactly where that's going to be spent tomorrow when you choose to make your gift today.
Jen, thank you so much for that overview of how you see disintermediation impacting the world of fundraising. Let's now invite Andy and Christine back into the conversation and tackle a series of really interesting questions that we have here on the table. To start with, it feels like in a variety of ways we've all been talking about the need to do a better job of perceiving what value looks like to our audiences and then delivering that value to them. One of the classic ways of resisting disintermediation is by providing value and focusing on value as defined by the users. Could we start off with just a quick conversation about how you think we can go about understanding what it is that our audiences value these days? And let me invite whoever feels like it to jump on in first.
Well, I'm ready. So, you know, I have to go back to your listening again. And the example that I was thinking about, well, there's two examples that I was thinking about. One is a post that came in our LinkedIn group from an alum. And about, I don't know, 130 other people chimed in. And the post led off, "Alumni benefits are lame." Now, if you read that, and you're an alumni affairs professional, you might feel a little hurt at first, right? You might feel a little like, what? Lame? Who is this person, this Andrew Gossen, writing this "alumni benefits are lame"? But
that's the sort of thing I would write, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. But once we, several of us got involved and started listening to the people, not only online but also off. I ended up calling some of the people who were really active in the discussion, having phone conversations with them, and really understanding what it was that they were trying to say and what it was that they needed. And we were able to essentially get them what they were looking for. But it's getting beyond that kind of initial horrible feeling of, oh my goodness, alumni benefits are lame. What do I do with that? Or, why are they saying those kind of not so nice things out there in the big wide world? And getting into that conversation, feeling comfortable there. Even though it's a group just for alumni, the LinkedIn group, our staff is in there and conversing and communicating and being part of that communication, that community, as one community as often as we can.
But it sounds like that's only going to work if they're there primarily to listen and then to do active listening, follow up to sort of clarify what's being said, as opposed to getting in there saying our benefits are not lame. And
yeah, I mean, well, right. You have to have people trained to do that and to be responsive in that way. But there was another great example just I think last week in the Huffington Post from Harvard, and the lead was why I'm not going to my Harvard reunion. And it, the first couple paragraphs read like a classic disintermediation. There's Facebook, and you can find me on LinkedIn, and et cetera, et cetera. But then what followed was an extensive, really dynamic post about state of education today, and to the points that Jen was just making about, the costs and so on and so forth. And I thought, well, if it had read Why I'm Not Coming to MIT's Reunion, I might call the person and say, let's do a symposium on this educational topic that you would like to talk about.
Andy, how does this work in the communication sphere? How much do you worry about what audiences actually want to hear as opposed to what you would like them to know?
Right. Well, I think what Christine is saying is very important in terms of listening. It does really go back to listening, and also the short answer to your question is to ask the audiences. Ask the audiences, what is the value? What value do we bring? And we may not like the answers, so we may want to be very careful in how we frame the questions. But in terms of understanding what is the value that we bring, we really need to talk to them and ask them. There is this challenge in public relations and in any form of communications, really, in terms of conveying what it is that we want you to know about us, as balancing that or juxtaposing that with what is it that the audience or the customer is interested in. So there may not be a strong alignment. Depends on the audience again. So if we're talking to alumni, obviously there is some sense of affinity there. If we're talking to another audience, that may not be as strong. So we need to think about what the ties are. What are the common bonds that we might have in terms of communicating with those different groups. I will say at Missouri S&T the last couple of years, we've been going through a strategic plan that's very customer focused, and in fact we identified 6 customer groups to work with, and we're asking them, we're talking to them about what is the value that we bring, because we want to talk about our value and the return on their investment, not just the ROI of starting salaries and things like that are measurable, but also talking to donors. What's the value of, what's the return on the investment that you provide to the university in terms of your gifts, and how can we better convey that? I think it goes back to the point Jennifer was making about there's not always that tangible outcome that we can tell folks when we're communicating about the annual fund or anything else. You can't, if they want to know what it's going for, you can't say, well, it's going to keep the lights on. That's not a very compelling case for fundraising if you're just saying, well, yeah, we're going to keep the lights on. Thank you for your gift. We need to show and demonstrate what it is tangibly, what value that we bring. So it goes back to asking and listening, I think.
So Jen, how does this play out in fundraising? I think that's certainly attention is a finite resource, but money is an even more finite resource. And if you're trying to get people to step up to the plate to support the institution, fundraisers talk a lot about donor-centric fundraising cultures, in which the needs of the donor are kind of front and center. How do you square that with the need, as Andy alluded to keep the lights on?
I think we need to do our very best to share what our priorities are, and talk about why they're so important. Hopefully, if we can make a good case for what the dollars are needed for, whether it's unrestricted dollars or restricted dollars, it's our job to explain why we need these funds for people. But I also think at the end of the day, we do need to listen to what they're telling us and see where the dollars are going, and that can help us uncover some hidden interests that we might not have even known about. And that's something that through our crowdfunding project has been a big fear, a big ceding of control to think about some of our higher level donors. Well, what if they're getting poached? What if they're disappearing from what we think they're going to give to and give somewhere else? Well, maybe that's actually a good thing. Maybe they're telling us what they're interested in, and that will turn into an even richer and longer-term relationship with the university if they're able to tell us what they're interested in, and hopefully still support those priorities that the university needs to be able to fulfill.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into this whole issue of control, because I think that's actually right there at the core of a lot of the trouble that the various different advancement areas have had with coping with digital and coping with disintermediation. How can we as a profession learn to be comfortable with the fact that control is, whatever control we might once have thought we had is now gone, and it's not coming back. How do we emotionally adjust to that reality in a way that's productive?
I'll dive in on that one. I'll talk a little bit about from the communication standpoint. I think we saw, and I'm going to just show my age here, but when we saw the advent of desktop publishing, for example, all of a sudden we saw a loss of control where everyone could create their own newsletters, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's moved on to the digital age, digital era, where everyone could create a website, a blog. When I created my WordPress blog, I looked at all these different templates that were available for free, many of them. And you can select something, and it looks pretty good, and I don't have to worry about paying a designer to help with that. Now it even, on our institutions, on our campuses, I think those of us who are in the area of brand management deal with issues regarding logos, taglines, those rogue elements that tend to pop up on websites from research centers or from departments. A new chair comes in and decides to have a logo contest, and a student designs something that all of a sudden, the next thing I know, it's on their website. So that loss of control is very much an issue, and it's fine for us when we're thinking about trying to control the brand identity in terms of the visuals. It's something where, frankly, it's a challenge to relinquish control in terms of developing a strong institutional brand. So, it's all well and good to talk about disintermediation when I'm talking about how the media have been disintermediated and how I respond to that. But it's a little more difficult to have the conversation about how do we cede control when we're so obsessed, and rightly so, I think, with developing a strong brand that is not only visually strong, that's just the element that most people want to mess around with, but also your messaging. So it becomes a challenge.
Yeah, I think that you have to decide, Andrew, where you want to control and where you want to catalyze and where you want to steward. And there are three different areas, right? What do you have to control, like the brand identity, and putting out the rules around that, and making sure those are clear. But there are other places where you can cede control and be a catalyst and be a good steward of the communication or the effort or the engagement or the connections without controlling them. I give you an example. At MIT, we allow alumni to make their own email groups up, and they can create an email group on any topic. And once a year, I note that this group of alums who are in the gaming industry get together at a particular gaming conference, and they use this email group just to, meet up, basically, is what they do, and kind of connect with each other at the gaming conference. We're not the intermediary of that, but we provided the tool by which they could make that happen. And that makes us relevant, I think.
Well, that's great, and I think that's a great way of adding value as well to that process.
I think from a fundraising perspective, I have no idea how you get comfortable with it, but I think you have to realize what's on the line. If we can't make compromises, if we can't find a way to build relationships and make ourselves relevant, the dollars will go elsewhere, and that's incredibly problematic. It's not just a matter of time or attention, which we need also, but if the dollars start to leave because we're not willing to compromise, that's not good.
Yeah, defending something that is no longer working quite so well to the point that it becomes counterproductive feels like we're actually not, that is not how we can best serve our institutions to accomplish the big picture goals that we're working towards. And that leads us to sort of the flip side of the question we just discussed. Would you be willing to share your thoughts on what some of the positive outcomes of relaxing control may be? Christine, I think you actually gave us the beginning of a pretty good example there of how you all provided the tool and then you got out of the way and let the community do something that actually is meaningful and provides substantial value to that community, but still with the MIT stamp on it.
Right, right. And there are myriad other ways in which we take institutional mission or vision, things that are happening, and give an opportunity for alums to meet each other around that mission. But sort of provide the interface, the tool, the place, the purpose, but let the people come together of their own accord.
I feel like a broken record again, but I think our crowdfunding experiment has been a great example of this. There was certainly the fear of what's going to happen. These are not unrestricted gifts, what's going on, but to see the number of previous non-donors or very long-lapsed donors that came back on board because of this project was absolutely a win for us, and we're really excited to see that. And again, even for higher level donors that are engaged, to find out what else they're interested in, to see them mobilize their connections, their classmates, their friends, has been really exciting for us to see.
I think getting back to the point Christine made about stewarding processes with social media, for example, with every department and every club, student group, etc. on campus wanting to have a social media presence, how can you help them? So, you know, even something as simple as creating a social media directory, providing some guidelines and standards for them to follow, and then including them in the social media directory, providing some assistance, letting them know that their presence in that directory sort of lends some credibility to their outreach in social media. And that's one thing that we've done just in the past year or so to try to, you know, number one, identify all the different social media outlets that there are that are official or semi-official, student groups, etc. And then also to help them broaden their impact as well in the social media sphere. So that's just one example, I think, of how we can, you know, do that on the communications end.
So it sounds like in all three of these examples, what's going on is a recognition that your community can actually help you if you're brave enough to let them do so, and that in some circumstances, I think Jen's crowdfunding example is a really good one here. They're likely to know their own networks far better than any sort of central database or central engagement or fundraising officer ever will. So if you let them go out there and act as agents on your behalf, you're going to get a reach that you're never going to get if you try to micromanage the whole dance. And then Andy, to your point, it sounds like there are lots of student groups, especially, who want to be good citizens on social media and represent the institution in a positive way, and that if you invest your energy in helping them do that and legitimizing them and giving them the spotlight by including them on this list and perhaps providing them with some branding and collateral that is sized appropriately for the various different channels, you're trusting them, and then they trust you in return, and you're not hemorrhaging energy and time into trying to make them stop doing this to start with.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it also lends an air of credibility to their social media outreach, that they are endorsed, I guess, by the university.
So in a weird way, getting back to a point that Christine made earlier about how there are these top-level strategic priorities that we all need to attend to, and then we work with our various audiences to try to make those happen on behalf of the institution. Are we in a bizarre place where we can actually achieve those strategic goals most effectively by disintermediating ourselves, sort of convening the right conversations and then getting out of the way and letting people get on with it?
Well, I don't want to be completely out of the way. I don't want to be completely disintermediated, and I guess I don't want to necessarily always see our programs as the intermediary, but I want to be in the right place at the right time, and where it's institutionally important when it's also important to alumni. Another example I was thinking about was a robotics competition that I'm involved in here at MIT, and we engage our alums around K-12 STEM education, and FIRST Robotics is a really massive robotics competition for ages 6 to 18. So that means for 5 days a year I'll be going to a massive robotics competition, and I'll be meeting with alums who are mentoring student teams and who are judging the competition, and I'll be meeting with alums who are parents of students in the competition, and I'll be meeting with students who are about to join the MIT community because they've been admitted to MIT, and I'll be talking to them about why they should come to MIT. So I'm sort of meeting the people where they are. They were going to be there anyway, and they were going to be talking about the importance of STEM education anyway, and they're going to continue to have that value, but I'm connecting that value back to MIT and back to the institution and the institution's priorities in education and the future of education in a way that helps the alumni see that, you know, the institution is relevant in their lives. So I don't want to be an intermediary, but I definitely want to be a catalyst. How about that?
That sounds like a good position. Andy or Jen, what are your thoughts on?
I think there is also somewhat of a consulting role. I think of, you know, just trying to look at different analogies to the intermediary thought, but, you know, like a concierge at a hotel, for example, is an individual who people go to because they have the expertise on where the best restaurants are in the area, etc. And so if we can think of our roles in terms more of facilitators and consultants in some ways, and I think each of us in our disciplines has a role to play in that regard. I was talking to somebody last week, in fact, I think disintermediation is a big word. What were you talking about? The delegitimization of news if you have a spokesperson speaking all the time on behalf of an institution. So, you know, the idea that I, as the spokesperson for Missouri S&T, would lack credibility in if there were a fire, for example, rather than having our police chief as the spokesperson. So how can we facilitate those conversations and facilitate so that those people are the spokespeople at the right time? The other thing I was thinking of was the idea of being an ambassador. And I think what Christine was explaining with the first robotics. By the way, were you in St. Louis then?
I was, indeed.
Yes, that was a big deal here. And we host the state championships for First Tech Challenge on our campus, so we had representation there too. And so that idea of being an ambassador and being out in front and meeting with people, I think, is important as well, and a role that we can play in all of our disciplines.
I would echo similar thoughts, just thinking that we need to challenge ourselves to be creative and still be relevant somehow. Even if we don't play the same intermediary role that we've traditionally played, we need to still play some sort of role. So it's whether we become a concierge or an ambassador, our role and our work may shift a little bit, but I think we'd be sorry to step out of the way altogether.
Yeah, there's a sort of analogy that you hear a lot in social media circles when people are talking about the way that the conversation has changed forever and how we're no longer necessarily looking to drive a conversation, but we are very much looking for a seat at the table at which the conversation is happening. And that may be a seat where we're doing much more listening than talking, but it's still important for us to be there. And maybe that's actually what we ought to be striving for strategically here. Just backing off a little bit and letting things happen in the way that they're likely to happen anyway, but at least we know they're going on.
I like the concierge analogy in that case, because I want both the institution and the alumni to come to me and ask me for help at the table, to ask them, to have them ask me to be at the table and to be facilitating those kinds of connections and utilizing the resources that I have accessible to me that they may not even know about. And that comes from, you know, the faculty side, the student side, the administrative side, the alumni side, the parent side, whatever way you want to look at the whole community. But so I really like that concierge analogy.
The challenge with the concierge analogy, I think, may be that the concierge doesn't go room to room knocking on doors and offering the services, and that's sometimes, I think, when we think about our roles, and being at the, being visible, being at the table. So maybe a concierge / ambassador or something, but and I think that also is a challenge in terms of, first of all, do we have the credibility among our different audiences to, so that they know to come to us for the services that we provide. And I think it's building that trust and that credibility as part of that process when we get to, so that we can become that go-to organization for those different constituents. It's a process.
And from the fundraising perspective, I think the more listening we do, the better the stories we can tell about impact, about how dollars are being used. Even if we can't tell you today how the dollars will be used tomorrow, if we can tell you we really need your dollars today, and then report back in 2 weeks, this is how your dollars were used. I think that builds that trust, that builds that credibility, and people may be more likely to continue to make their higher ed institution a priority in their philanthropy.
Jen, I really like the fact that you used the word trust in that summation right there, because I think that underscores another theme that's woven its way throughout the hour, the fact that this is really still all about relationships, and that if we focus on the relationship and we don't get too wrapped up in what medium the relationship is playing out in, we're probably doing good long-term work on behalf of our institutions. So we are coming close to the end of our hour. I'd like to close with just one final simple question. Could each of you share with the audience an example of an institution or a non-higher ed nonprofit that you think is doing a really good job at communicating its relevance to, I guess, or delivering on value to its audience in this disintermediated media environment?
Well, we're high on charitywater.org right now. We've been looking at their website a lot as an example, so take a look, see what you think.
And they have a luscious Instagram account. I've never seen water look so good.
I think there's a website that's become fairly popular called medium.com, that where you have a lot of people writing some very good content about a breadth of topics. And I think that's a good example of showing how basically it's the idea of what we used to call citizen journalism, right? The idea of the community coming together to create content that's compelling and that is getting shared and being viewed even by more traditional media and being used and picked up by them.
And I would say that Medium has a delightful user interface, so I'm quite high on them as well. Jen, how about you?
I was not at all prepared for this question. I can't think of a specific site or project, but I guess when I think about success, I think about some of the projects and things that I've seen on Donors Choose, and just thinking about some of the ongoing communication and the relationships that are being built with donors through small-scale projects like that. I think the more connection you feel to where your dollars are going, the more fulfilled you feel by the experience as giving your money.
Speaking of Donors Choose, I was actually thinking of a for-profit, a company, the company that makes Cards Against Humanity, and what they did with Donors Choose as part of their holiday event last year. So if you're not familiar with that, just search Cards Against Humanity, Donors Choose, and you'll find an interesting tale about how they not only how they raised funds, but how they compellingly told the story of what it went for.
I'll have to check it out. That game is awesome.
So I'm going to abuse my role as host and share my own thought on this. Probably the single best book I've read over the past year is called The International Bank of Bob, and it is a book that was written by a journalist who had an existential crisis while doing sort of high-end travel journalism. And he worked with Kiva.org, which is the microfinance website, to actually go to various different countries in which Kiva operates and track down not only the local microfinance nonprofits that distribute the funds, but also in some cases the people to whom he lent money. And it's an incredibly funny and easy to read book, but he gets right down there on the ground and illustrates the impact of that sort of micro philanthropy in a way that I haven't really encountered in too many other places. And in my fantasies, I think a lot about how we might be able to do that kind of incredibly impactful, accessible storytelling on behalf of our institutions, and flip the question of well, why should I give to your institution, to why in the world wouldn't I give to your institution if those sorts of outcomes are what giving to your institution produces. We are at the end of our hour. Andy, Christine, Jen, thank you so much. I love this topic. I love the perspectives that you all brought to this conversation. I hope that we can get more folks in advancement talking about this, because I think it's really important, and not only is it important, but it's fun to talk about, and it's exciting. Thank you for your time. Thank you to those of you who tuned in today. We've had a pretty healthy audience, and we are now at the end of our hour. My co-host, Ryan Catherwood, will be back in 2 weeks with a great show that is focused on events and storytelling in donor relations and stewardship. Once again, thank you to our sponsor, iModules, and as always, you can watch more shows from Advancement Pros on the Advancement Live archive located at higheredlive.com. Thanks to everyone who tuned in, and see you next time.